Picture a lone samurai standing on a misty plain at dawn, the silence broken only by the whisper of silk armor and the distant cry of a hawk. He kneels, not to pray to the gods of war, but to arrange his inkstone and brushes with a reverence most would reserve for a sacred ritual. This warrior, whose hands could draw a blade faster than the eye can follow, now holds a brush with the same deadly precision. It seems impossible, doesn't it? A killer who is also an artist, a paradox that defies everything we think we know about these legendary fighters. Yet here lies one of history's best kept secrets. For the samurai, the brush was not merely a tool of peace. It was, in its own right, a weapon. Welcome to the hidden world of samurai calligraphy, where a single stroke of ink could carry the weight of life or death. In this realm, elegance was not just art, it was strategy. Grace was not just beauty, it was power. Every curve of a character, every splash of ink, every moment of focused stillness contained lessons that shaped the fate of empires and the souls of warriors. We often imagine these figures through the glamour of battle, the shine of the katana, the honor of the duel. But behind the armor and the legend stood a discipline far older, far deeper, and in many ways far more revealing of what it truly meant to be samurai. This is not a story about pretty handwriting. This is a journey into the heart of a culture where mind, body, and spirit converged on the blank page. Where a samurai's character was judged not by how many enemies he cut down, but by how he held his brush, where the same focus that guided a perfect strike also guided a perfect character. You are about to enter a world where art was combat, and combat was art, a world that still whispers its lessons to those willing to listen. So join me as we uncover the secrets of samurai calligraphy and discover how the stroke of a brush could carry the force of a sword. To understand this union of brush and sword, we must first look beyond the physical to the philosophical core that bound them together, the samurai code of bushido. This was far more than a simple list of rules for battle. It was a complete way of life, a spiritual path that demanded moral integrity, unwavering loyalty, and ultimate mastery over oneself. The warrior was expected to cultivate not just strength, but also wisdom and cultural refinement. This is where the art of shodo, the way of calligraphy, enters the picture. It was never a separate hobby or a peaceful distraction from the violence of their profession. For a samurai, dipping his brush into ink was a continuation of his training, another form of practicing his code. The critical link between these two seemingly opposite worlds is a profound mental state known as mushin, often translated as no mind. This is not a state of being empty or unconscious, but rather a state of pure, undistracted awareness. It is a mind free from hesitation, from fear, from ego, and from the constant chatter of conscious thought. In the heat of combat, a samurai could not afford to think, should I parry now? Is my foot positioned correctly? That split second of doubt could be fatal. His movements had to flow instinctively from a place of deep, trained intuition. His sword became an extension of his body, and his mind became a clear mirror, simply reflecting the reality of the moment without judgment. Now, pick up a calligraphy brush. The materials themselves demand this same state of mind. You have a sheet of delicate, absorbent rice paper. You have a pot of black ink that cannot be erased. There are no second chances, no undo button. Like a life or death confrontation, each stroke is irrevocable. The moment the brush touches the paper, you must commit with absolute certainty. Any flicker of hesitation, any tremor of doubt, will be captured forever in the shaky, imperfect line. The samurai, through endless repetition, trained his mind to enter that same zone of flawless execution. The focus required to paint a single, powerful character with perfect pressure, rhythm, and spacing was identical to the focus needed to execute a single, perfect sword stroke. Both were acts of decisive action under immense pressure. This is why great daimyo lords and renowned sword masters would spend hours in their study, practicing their characters. They weren't just learning to write beautifully, they were engaging in essential combat training. They were honing the very qualities that would keep them alive on the battlefield: impeccable precision, total emotional control, and the ability to act with clarity and purpose in a single defining moment. The brush taught the sword patience and grace, while the sword taught the brush strength and intention. They were not two different paths, but two sides of the same coin, both leading to the mastery of the self. But mastering the mind was only one layer of this ancient practice. The true sophistication of samurai calligraphy reveals itself when we discover it was far more than a personal exercise. It was a clandestine communication network, a cryptographic tool of immense subtlety. In an era of constant political intrigue and shifting alliances, sending a secret message was a matter of life and death. And the samurai's solution was genius. They hid their most dangerous secrets not in code, but in art, placing them directly in plain sight for only a chosen few to decipher. An intercepted scroll would not appear to be a military document at all. To any suspicious guard or rival lord, it was simply a beautiful piece of poetry, a philosophical meditation, or a copy of a classic text. The real message was concealed within the artistry of the brushwork itself. The first layer of encryption was in the spacing between characters, known as ma. To the untrained eye, the characters might simply be arranged for aesthetic balance, but to a fellow initiate, a slightly wider gap between two specific words could signal the location of a meeting. A cluster of characters placed unusually close together might indicate the number of enemy troops. The rhythm and flow of the text, something only another skilled calligrapher would truly notice, could map out an entire strategy. The variations in ink saturation told another part of the story. A samurai would grind his own ink stick on an ink stone, mixing it with water to achieve the perfect consistency. This process itself was meditative, but it also allowed for deliberate manipulation. A character written with exceptionally dark, rich ink, almost bursting from the page, could be an emphasized command, a word of critical importance. A faint, almost whispery stroke, where the brush was nearly dry, might denote caution or secrecy. The texture of the paper itself played a role. A message of war might be written on a coarse, sturdy paper, while a communique about a fragile truce could be on the most delicate silk paper, a tactile warning to handle the situation with care. Perhaps the most secure method was the use of a pre-arranged style or script. There are many in Japanese calligraphy, from the precise and formal kaisho to the wildly cursive sosho. Two allied lords might agree that any message written in the highly abstract sosho script, which is nearly illegible to those not extensively trained in it, contained their true intentions. The apparent poem on the surface would be a decoy, while the real meaning was locked in the fluid, interconnected strokes that only your intended recipient could read. This turned every artistic choice into a potential key, making the act of writing a simultaneous act of encryption. This practice elevated calligraphy from a mental discipline to a vital strategic skill. A samurai wasn't just judged on how well he could write, but on how well he could conceal and reveal. His literacy was his security clearance, his brush his cipher. It was a silent language spoken between the lines, a testament to their belief that true power lay not in brute force alone, but in the unmatched subtlety of a cultivated mind. The greatest secrets of the samurai were never hidden in locked chests. They were displayed proudly on the wall, waiting for an enemy to admire their beauty while completely missing their meaning. But this art of hidden messages reaches its most intense, most personal form in a practice that went far beyond strategy and deep into the very soul of a samurai's promise. We move now from the subtlety of encrypted poetry to a type of document that was terrifyingly direct, a vow that left no room for interpretation or doubt. This was Kapan, the Blood Oath. Imagine the scene, a dimly lit chamber. A new retainer kneels before his daimyo lord, the air thick with the gravity of the moment. There is no inkstone present. Instead, a small, sharp dagger is produced. Without a flinch, the samurai draws the blade across his finger or the palm of his hand. He watches as his own life's essence wells up, and he lets it drip into a small dish. He then takes his finest brush, dips it not in black ink, but in this deep crimson liquid, and begins to write his name. This was not just a signature. It was a symbolic act of ultimate commitment. By using his very blood as ink, he was quite literally binding his life to his word, signing a pledge of loyalty that was meant to last until his death. The documents they created, known as kapansho, were more than contracts. They were sacred artifacts. The text itself was often a formal vow of fealty, swearing unwavering service to the Lord and his clan, and renouncing all ties to enemies. But the power of the document didn't just reside in the words. It was in the medium. The dark, rust-brown signature staring up from the page was a permanent, physical reminder of that moment of pledge. It was a promise written in a substance that everyone in the room understood intimately, the substance of life itself. To break such an oath was considered the deepest shame, a betrayal that stained one's honor far more viscerally than any ink could stain paper. It was a spiritual transgression, as your own blood, there on the document, would bear witness against you. Surviving examples of these blood oaths in museums and private collections are haunting to behold. Centuries later, the paper has yellowed and grown fragile, but the signatures remain, faded to a faint, ghostly brownish red. You can lean in close and sometimes see the delicate brushstrokes, the confident flourishes of a name written under the most profound pressure imaginable. These are not the shaky marks of a fearful man. They are often executed with the same disciplined control and artistry as any great work of calligraphy. This reveals the dual nature of the act. Even in this most visceral of rituals, the samurai's training took over. The focus on precision, on beauty of form, on the decisive stroke, it all remained. The brush was an instrument of his will, whether it carried blood or ink. The practice of kapan represents the ultimate convergence of the physical and the spiritual in samurai culture. It fused the artistic discipline of calligraphy with the brutal reality of their existence. It was a vow that acknowledged a simple, stark truth, that a samurai's loyalty was not a casual agreement, but a bond stronger than life itself. His word, his art, and his very being were inseparable, all flowing from the same source of unwavering intent. And so we arrive at one of the most brilliant and counterintuitive tactics in the samurai's secretive art, the principle of strategic imperfection. After mastering the flawless stroke, the ultimate test of a true master was knowing precisely when and how to break his own perfection. In this shadowy world of espionage, a message that was too perfect could be its own kind of failure. A scroll of breathtaking beauty would draw attention, admiration, and intense scrutiny, the exact opposite of what a covert operative would want. The solution was a devious stroke of genius, authenticating a message by deliberately including a flaw. This was not a random error or a moment of carelessness. It was a calculated, pre-arranged signature woven into the very fabric of the writing. A master calligrapher and his intended recipient would agree upon a specific mistake. It could be a single character written with a slightly incorrect stroke order, making its shape just a little unbalanced to the trained eye. It might be a tiny, intentional splash of ink in the margin, a fleck that looked like an accident but served as a deliberate mark. Perhaps it was the subtle mishandling of the brush on a single downward stroke, creating a faint, hesitant tremor that betrayed a moment of supposed uncertainty. To anyone else, these would be simple human errors. But to the ally who knew what to look for, that flawed stroke was the most secure seal of authenticity imaginable. It was a secret handshake rendered in ink. This practice served a dual purpose, each layer more cunning than the last. First, it authenticated the message. If a rival agent intercepted a scroll and tried to forge a reply, he would naturally try to replicate its beauty. He would painstakingly copy the poem and strive for perfect, elegant characters. He would never think to carefully reproduce a specific, awkward mistake. Therefore, when the genuine samurai received the reply, he would immediately know it was a forgery because it was too perfect, the agreed-upon flaw was missing. The absence of the error was the proof of the deception. Second, and just as importantly, the intentional flaw made the document appear less threatening. A scroll that looked like the work of a moderately skilled amateur, perhaps a lower-ranking soldier or a slightly clumsy courtier, was far less likely to be seized and examined by enemy spies than a masterpiece that screamed of being authored by a high-ranking strategist. It was a form of cultural camouflage. The samurai was using the perception of his own art against his enemies, hiding the brilliant mind of a general behind the supposedly clumsy hand of a novice. He made his most vital communications appear ordinary, and in doing so, rendered them extraordinary in their security. This concept of strategic imperfection finds a powerful parallel in the Japanese aesthetic principle of wabi-sabi, which finds beauty in asymmetry, impermanence, and the imperfect. A cracked teacup, repaired with gold, is considered more beautiful for having been broken. The deliberate flaw in calligraphy was a martial application of this philosophy. It acknowledged that true authenticity isn't found in sterile perfection, but in the unique, identifiable marks of the individual. The flawed stroke was the calligrapher's spiritual fingerprint, an unmistakable part of his identity that could not be copied. It required a supreme confidence to execute a master first had to achieve perfection before he could deconstruct it with purpose. This was the highest level of the art, where total control was demonstrated not through flawless execution, but through the conscious and meaningful decision to be imperfect. Yet the samurai's manipulation of their medium extended far beyond the visual into the realm of sensory psychology. They understood that a message's power wasn't carried by words alone, but by the very substance of the ink itself. The creation of sumi ink was a deeply personal and strategic process, and a master could alter its fundamental properties to produce a specific, calculated effect on the recipient. By grinding the ink stick with intentionality and adding rare ingredients, a samurai could turn a simple scroll into a multi-sensory experience designed to intimidate, soothe, or command before a single word was even read. Consider the psychological impact of receiving a declaration of war. A typical message written in standard black ink is threatening, but a letter delivered from a rival lord, written in a deep, unsettling crimson that vividly resembles freshly spilled blood, is an act of pure psychological terror. Historical accounts suggest some samurai achieved this effect by mixing their ink with pigments from red ochre or even, as legend implies, by actually incorporating small amounts of blood or iron oxide to give the ink a metallic, coppery scent reminiscent of a battlefield. To unroll such a document was to be immediately confronted with the visceral reality of conflict. The message wasn't just about war, it felt and smelled like war. It was a nonverbal proclamation that left no doubt about the sender's ruthless intent, aiming to shatter the enemy's composure and sow fear from the very first glance. Conversely, in the delicate dance of diplomacy, the goal was often to de-escalate and persuade. For these situations, the samurai's approach to ink was utterly different. They might prepare a batch with the utmost care, grinding the ink stick for an exceptionally long time to achieve a smooth, serene blackness, and then infuse the mixture with a few drops of a subtle, calming fragrance. A faint whisper of sandalwood, plum blossom, or alpine cedar could be introduced into the wet ink. When the recipient, perhaps a wary ally or a neutral party, opened the scroll, they wouldn't be met with an aggressive sight, but with a surprising and pleasing aroma. This subtle sensory detail subconsciously framed the entire message. It signaled respect, cultivated a sense of peace, and made the recipient more receptive to the proposals within. It was a masterclass in soft power, using a pleasant fragrance as a tool to lower defenses and open a pathway to agreement, the most astonishing tactic, reserved for communications between the highest-ranking lords, involved the use of powdered precious metals. By carefully grinding gold, silver, or bronze into a fine dust and mixing it into the ink, a calligrapher could create characters that shimmered and glittered with an almost otherworldly light. This was far more than a display of vast wealth. It was a demonstration of nearly divine power and authority. A demand written in gleaming gold ink was not a request. It was a decree from a level of society so elevated that it seemed to operate by different rules. The shimmering text, catching the light with every slight movement of the paper, would have been mesmerizing and utterly unforgettable. It created a lasting impression of the sender's unassailable status, making refusal feel not just dangerous, but sacrilegious. The message, through its dazzling medium, became an object of awe. This intricate knowledge of ink alchemy reveals a sophistication that transcends the stereotype of the samurai as a simple warrior. It shows a profound understanding of human psychology, how scent can trigger memory and emotion, how color can evoke primal fear, and how light can command reverence. Every aspect of the missive, from the texture of the paper to the scent and sheen of the ink, was a carefully chosen variable in a psychological equation. The samurai knew that to truly win a conflict, you had to first win the mind of your opponent, and sometimes the most powerful weapon was not a blade at the throat, but a beautifully unsettling sensation that lingered long after the scroll was rolled shut. Yet for all the cunning in their ink, the samurai's most ingenious secrets were woven not with liquid, but with fiber. The paper itself became a fortress, a medium engineered for deception and protection with a level of sophistication that rivals modern security printing. This was not mere stationery. It was a technological marvel, crafted through an artisanal process known as washi making, where the very sheet of paper could be designed to conceal, reveal, and authenticate. The first layer of security began with the pulp. Skilled papermakers could embed subtle, nearly invisible symbols directly into the matrix of the paper while it was still wet and malleable. Using finer, differently colored fibers or even strands of silk, they would weave a clansman, its family crest, or a specific kanji character into the sheet. To the casual observer holding the finished document, this watermark-like feature might be completely unnoticed, but when the scroll was lifted to a light source, the hidden emblem would appear, silhouetted against the glow, providing immediate authentication of the document's origin. It was a seal that could not be forged by simply copying the text, as it was part of the paper's very substance. A spy trying to replicate a message would have to first replicate the papermaker's art, a closely guarded secret in itself. The deception grew more complex with the use of layered sheets. A samurai strategist might compose a message using not one, but 2 or 3 incredibly thin sheets of paper pressed together. The outer layer, the one immediately visible, would contain a perfectly plausible but entirely fake message, and perhaps troop movements for a non-existent front or peace overtures meant to misdirect. This was the decoy, designed to satisfy any intercepting agent. However, sandwiched invisibly between these outer layers was a second sheet, containing the true orders. This core message could only be accessed by carefully and knowledgeably peeling the layers apart, a delicate operation that would destroy the outer decoy message in the process. This ensured that if the document was seized and examined, the enemy would find only the disinformation, while the true recipient, aware of the technique, could unlock the real intelligence hidden within. Some documents took this principle of revelation a step further, employing techniques that feel astonishingly ahead of their time. Certain scrolls were designed to be read only under very specific conditions. A message might be written with a special ink made from the viscous juice of certain fruits or plants, which would be transparent and virtually invisible once it dried on the paper. The writing would remain hidden until the page was gently warmed over a candle flame, causing the organic compounds in the ink to caramelize and turn a dark brown, revealing the secret text. Others required a chemical developer, a faint brushstroke of a reactive substance like soybean juice or alum solution across the page, to make the hidden characters appear. This was the ultimate dead drop, a seemingly blank piece of paper that could be carried openly without arousing the slightest suspicion, its dangerous contents dormant until the precise moment of its intended use. This transformation of paper from a passive surface into an active participant in espionage represents a pinnacle of the samurai's innovative spirit. They understood that security was not just about the message, but about the entire object carrying it. Every element, the fiber, the layer, the hidden reaction, was a line of defense. It was a holistic approach that turned a simple scroll into a vault, a trick box, and a time-release capsule of information all at once. In the hands of a samurai, paper was never just paper. It was a silent partner in strategy, a testament to the fact that their greatest weapon was, and always would be, the ingenuity of the mind. Beyond the scent of the ink and the layers of the paper lay the most abstract and brilliant layer of all, the transformation of art into a living map. For the highest echelon of samurai strategists, a calligraphic scroll could become a perfect, undetectable battle plan. They achieved this not by writing about the terrain, but by making the very act of writing become the terrain. The key to this cipher was a style known as sosho, or grass script. To the uninitiated, a work in sosho appears as a beautiful, chaotic whirlwind of brushstrokes, a wildly abstract and fluid expression that is famously difficult to read. But in the hands of a general, This apparent chaos was a meticulously crafted simulation of the battlefield. The flow and rhythm of the entire text served as the first layer of the map. The continuous, interconnected strokes of the grass script didn't just represent words. They charted the flow of a river or the contour of a mountain range. A long, sweeping horizontal stroke might not be a character at all, but a symbolic representation of a valley floor. A sharp, abrupt vertical drop in the brushwork could indicate a steep cliff face. The empty spaces on the page, the deliberate pauses known as ma, were not just aesthetic breaks, but represented open fields, marshes, or other key features of the landscape. The entire composition of the scroll, therefore, was a bird's eye view of the territory, drawn not with lines but with language itself. The physical quality of each stroke added the next layer of tactical detail. The thickness of a line, controlled by the pressure and angle of the brush, conveyed critical information about troop strength and movement. A thick, dark, powerful stroke, laid down with a heavy hand and a full load of ink, could symbolize a main force, a dense battalion moving with decisive purpose. In contrast, a thin, whispery, quickly fading line might represent a small scouting party or a swift cavalry unit. The variation in the ink's density from a deep, saturated black to a dry, scratchy gray could indicate whether a unit was fresh and well supplied or fatigued and stretched thin. The general receiving the scroll could literally feel the weight of the army's movements through the visual weight of the ink, but the most precise instructions were communicated through the smallest marks, the dots and accents. In normal writing, a dot or 10 is a simple punctuation mark. On a calligraphic battle map, it was everything. A single, perfectly placed dot of intense black ink could mark the ideal location for an ambush. A cluster of smaller dots might indicate the suggested placement for a series of watchtowers or signal fires. The specific shape of the dot even held meaning. A round, carefully executed dot could signal a defensive stronghold, while a swift, sharp, dagger-like dot might be the mark for an offensive strike point. These tiny specks were the coordinates upon which the entire campaign could hinge, hidden in plain sight among the artistic flourishes. To understand how this worked in practice, imagine a daimyo lord unrolling a scroll from his most trusted scout. He sees not a report, but a dynamic painting of a landscape rendered in script. His eyes follow the torrential flow of characters from the top, which charts the course of a rushing river. He notes a particularly thick, dark stroke branching off from the main flow. This is the main body of his army, positioned to cross at a ford. His gaze then travels to a series of sharp, angular strokes on the high ground to the right. These represent the enemy's fortified position. And finally, he spots it. A small, isolated, but confident dot nestled in a grove of thinner, weed-like strokes just behind the enemy lines. That is the scout himself, indicating the perfect, unseen route for a flanking maneuver. The entire strategy is contained in a piece of art that could be openly displayed. Its true nature visible only to the general who held the key to its meaning. This was the ultimate fusion of the samurai's dual disciplines, where the mind of the artist and the mind of the general became one. In the shadow of the duel, where the clash of steel decided immediate victory, there existed another, more nuanced arena for settling disputes, one where the sharpness of the mind and the steadiness of the hand carried far greater weight than the edge of a blade. This was the world of the dueling brush, a formal competition where rival samurai would resolve their most heated conflicts not on the battlefield, but over the inkstone. The stakes in these contests were immeasurable, often involving the honor of one's entire lineage and their future standing within the rigid social hierarchy. To lose such a match could be a more devastating and lasting defeat than any physical injury. The challenge would typically begin with a formal invitation, a scroll delivered with the same grave ceremony as a request for a duel. But instead of naming a time and place for combat, it proposed a shodo teikai, a calligraphy meeting. The terms were set, a specific theme, often a profound phrase from Confucian texts or a line of Zen poetry, and a strict format to follow. Accepting this challenge was as binding as accepting a fight. A samurai could not refuse without admitting a lack of cultural refinement, which was itself a deep shame. He was now committed to a contest where his entire education, discipline, and inner character would be judged in the space of a few irrevocable strokes. The atmosphere during these events was charged with a tension that was both intellectual and visceral. The two opponents would kneel in silence, often in a garden setting or a sparse terrace, surrounded by a small panel of esteemed judges, usually elder statesmen, respected monks, or retired generals. The air would be thick with the scent of pine and ink, the only sound the gentle scraping of the ink stick against the stone and the soft rustle of silk. There were no angry shouts or visible threats. The aggression was channeled inward, transformed into an intense, laser-focused calm. Each samurai knew that his every movement was being scrutinized. The way he held his brush, his posture, his breathing, and the decisive moment his tool met the paper would all be interpreted as reflections of his spirit. Victory was not judged on personal taste. The criteria were precise and unforgiving. The judges would assess the essential three perfections: the strength and structure of the stroke, the vital energy and rhythm of the character, and the overall balance and harmony of the composition. A technically perfect character that lacked Kai life force would be deemed inferior to a slightly imperfect one that pulsed with raw, controlled power. The slightest tremor born of nervousness, a hesitancy in the sweep of a curve, or a clumsy distribution of ink could betray a lack of resolve and hand the victory to the opponent. The judgment was final, and its consequences were immediate and severe. Consider the ramifications. A samurai who lost a sword duel might be killed, his honor preserved in death. But a samurai who lost a calligraphy duel faced a living humiliation. He might be forced to cede a prized territory, to withdraw a political challenge, or, most painfully, to publicly apologize and acknowledge the superior cultivation of his rival. This defeat would ripple through his family for generations, marking them as culturally inferior in a society that placed the arts on the same pedestal as martial prowess. His name would be remembered not for a lack of courage, but for a lack of grace. For a warrior class built on the concept of face, this was a fate sometimes worse than death. This practice reveals the incredible duality at the core of the samurai ethos. It proves that their culture was not a simple celebration of violence, but a complex system that valued psychological mastery and aesthetic achievement as the ultimate signs of a truly developed human being. To win with the brush required all the same qualities needed to win with the sword: courage, focus, decisiveness, and impeccable timing, but it also demanded a sensitivity and refinement that brute force could never provide. The dueling brush was the highest test of a complete warrior, one who understood that true power was found not in the ability to destroy, but in the ability to create with absolute conviction. Beyond the dueling grounds and the war rooms, the samurai's belief in the power of the brush reached its most profound and personal expression. For these warriors, whose lives were a constant dance with mortality, calligraphy became a sacred act, a way to forge spiritual armor as vital as the steel plates they wore in battle. This was not about strategy or deception. It was about pure faith. They turned to the art of shuji, the ritual writing of sacred texts, to create powerful talismans that they believed could deflect not only arrows and blades, but also misfortune and malevolent spirits. The process was a meticulous ceremony in itself. A samurai would begin by purifying both his space and himself, often through meditation, fasting, or cleansing rituals. He would then prepare his ink with a reverence usually reserved for a religious offering, grinding the ink stick on the stone with slow, mindful circles, each rotation a silent prayer. The paper selected was often of the highest quality, sometimes even specially consecrated at a local shrine. Then he would choose his text, typically a potent passage from a Buddhist sutra, like the Heart Sutra prized for its concise power, or a prayer to the Shinto gods of war and protection. The act of writing was not undertaken to produce a beautiful piece of art for display. It was a deep, meditative practice of devotion. With each character he painted, the samurai wasn't just copying words. He was channeling the essence of their meaning directly from the divine and into the physical form of the ink and paper. His focus was absolute, his breath steady, his entire being poured into the intention of protection. Once completed, these sacred inscriptions were treated with the utmost care. They were not left on a desk. The most common practice was to carefully fold the paper, often in a specific, traditional way, and then encase it in a small silk pouch. This pouch was then worn on the body, tucked securely beneath the chest plate of the samurai's armor. In this way, the talisman sat directly over the heart, becoming a literal spiritual shield. It was a deeply personal article of faith, a secret comfort carried into the chaos of combat. A warrior would feel its presence with every movement, a constant reminder of the divine protection he had actively invited through his own disciplined action. This wasn't a superstitious charm bought from a vendor. It was a bespoke piece of armor for the soul, crafted by his own hand and infused with his own focused kai, or life energy. The belief in the efficacy of these talismans was absolute. There are numerous accounts in diaries and battle records of samurai attributing their survival to these inscribed papers. A near miss from an arrow, a sword strike that glanced off at the last second, or even just the fortune of emerging unscathed from a field of fallen comrades, all could be interpreted as proof of the talisman's power. This practice highlights a fascinating aspect of the samurai psyche, a seamless fusion of brutal pragmatism and profound spirituality. The same man who could coolly strategize the fall of a castle would also place his faith in a folded piece of paper, seeing no contradiction between the two. For him, victory required mastery on every level: the tactical, the physical, and the spiritual. The calligraphy talisman was his way of ensuring he was protected on all fronts, making his spirit as resilient as his body. But perhaps the most ghostly and brilliant of all these techniques was reserved for messages that needed to vanish not just from sight, but from time itself. Within the most secretive schools of thought, masters developed a method so cunning it bordered on alchemy: the art of the ghost character. This was not merely invisible ink meant to be revealed moments later. This was a patient, long-game strategy designed to create a true phantom message, one that would appear, be read, disappear forever, and then, astonishingly, reappear years or even decades later under precisely the right conditions. The process began with a meticulously formulated ink. The base was not the standard pine soot and animal glue of traditional sumi, but a volatile mixture of organic compounds. Historical accounts and whispered traditions suggest recipes involving the delicate, nearly colorless juices of certain fruits like the yuzu citrus, combined with subtle reagents such as rice vinegar or ferments derived from soy. The calligrapher would grind these ingredients into a clear or faintly tinted liquid that, when applied to high-quality washi paper, would be almost completely invisible once it dried. The writing was done with the same disciplined strokes as any great masterpiece, the hand moving through the forms from memory and muscle alone, tracing unseen words onto a seemingly blank sheet. The recipient, having been forewarned through an entirely separate, secure channel, knew how to conjure the message. The method of revelation was often as simple as holding the paper close to a gentle heat source, not a candle flame that might scorch it, but the steady warmth of a hand or the soft glow of a lantern. The heat would cause the organic compounds in the ink to undergo a brief chemical reaction, darkening them just enough to become legible for a short window of time. The message would be read quickly, its contents memorized, and then, as the paper cooled, the characters would fade back into nothingness, leaving no physical evidence behind. The information had been transferred, and the scroll could then be stored or even discarded without risk, as it appeared to be utterly blank. The true genius, however, lay in the second act of this chemical play. These master ink makers discovered that by altering the formula slightly, they could build in a delayed reaction. A message written with this advanced ghost ink would perform its first vanishing act as expected. But then, after a predetermined period, often many years, triggered by the slow, inevitable process of oxidation as the paper aged, the message would faintly reappear on its own. The long-term chemical change would cause the once invisible characters to develop a permanent, ghostly brown stain, like a faint sepia-toned photograph emerging from the paper fibers. This was the ultimate dead drop for a long-term stratagem. A samurai could leave a message for his son, or a lord for his successor, hidden in a scroll that looked entirely innocent. It would wait, dormant and undetectable, until the day its wisdom was needed most, revealing its secrets to the next generation at the exact right moment in history. It was a message from the past, sent on a journey through time, to land in the hands of the future. This ever-shifting landscape of codes, however, found its most elegant and impenetrable expression in a system that was as beautiful as it was brilliant. A cryptographic calendar synchronized with the turning of the seasons and the rhythm of Japan's most cherished festivals. For a rival spy trying to crack the samurai's communications, understanding the basic principles of hidden spacing or ink density was one thing, but without an intimate knowledge of Japanese poetry, art, and annual celebrations, their efforts were utterly hopeless. The samurai didn't just use codes. They wove their messages into the very fabric of their culture, creating a living, breathing cipher that changed with the moon and the blossoms. The foundation of this system was the deep, shared cultural literacy of the samurai class. Every educated warrior was steeped in the same classical poetry, the same aesthetic ideals, and the same annual cycle of festivities. They all knew that cherry blossoms were not just flowers. They were a potent symbol of spring's fleeting beauty and the samurai's own mortality. They understood that the autumn moon evoked feelings of poignant sadness, reflection, and the passage of time. This shared symbolic language became their most secure cryptographic key. A scroll arriving in the early days of April, adorned with a delicate painted cherry branch in the margin, was immediately understood to be using the spring cipher. The receiver would know to interpret the spacing between characters, the thickness of the strokes, and the placement of any dots according to the pre-arranged rules for that season. The same scroll arriving in October with a subtle sketch of a full moon would be deciphered using a completely different autumnal set of rules. The imagery itself was the trigger, the visual signal that told the recipient which cryptographic key to apply. This method was devastatingly effective against outsiders for one simple reason. The cultural context was the lock, and the key could not be stolen. A European interceptor might be a brilliant codebreaker, but if he saw a painting of a bird on a branch, he would simply see a bird on a branch. He would have no reason to connect it to a specific poem by the classical poet Ono no Kamachi, and therefore no way to know that this particular bird indicated that the third character of every line was to be ignored. The true meaning was hidden in a layer of cultural illusion that was second nature to the samurai, but an indecipherable mystery to anyone else. The system was built on centuries of shared art and literature, a vast and complex web of associations that could not be quickly learned or faked. The annual festival calendar added another rotating layer of complexity. A message sent during the week of the Tanabata Star Festival, which celebrates the mythical meeting of two celestial lovers, might use a cipher based on the positions of stars mentioned in the associated legend. A communique composed around the time of the Boys' Day Festival, with its iconic carp streamers, could use a code where the number of strokes in a specific character corresponded to the number of paper carp flown, indicating troop numbers. The timing of the message delivery was itself a critical part of the decryption process. A spy could intercept 100 messages, but without knowing the exact cultural moment they were sent, the specific poem being celebrated that week, the exact phase of the moon, the particular flower in bloom, he would be trying to solve a puzzle with a million possible solutions, each one leading him further down a path of elegant deception. The samurai had turned their entire way of life into an unbreakable code, proving that the most powerful encryption isn't just found in mathematics, but in meaning itself. But to coordinate something as complex as a multi-pronged military operation, you need more than just general instructions hidden in the art. You need a clock. You need exact, synchronized timing. And this is where the samurai's artistry reached one of its most subtle and brilliant heights, the art of strategic hesitation. In a world without watches or radio signals, how do you secretly communicate the precise hour for an attack to dozens of commanders spread across a province? The answer lies not in the strokes of the brush, but in the empty spaces between them, and in the quiet moments where the brush pauses to drink. This technique revolved around two masterfully controlled imperfections: the deliberate pause, known as ma, and the intentional pool of ink, called bakashi. To the untrained eye, these are simply aesthetic choices, the natural rhythm of a writer thinking, or a moment where a bit too much ink was allowed to gather. But to an initiated ally, these features were a precise visual metronome. The samurai developed a complex system where the specific placement and quality of these pauses and pools corresponded to a detailed calendar and clock. A wide, breathy gap following a character written in the forceful kaisho style might represent a delay of several days. A much smaller, almost imperceptible hesitation between two swiftly cursive characters could indicate a matter of hours. The system was granular, and its mastery required that both the sender and receiver had practiced interpreting these pauses with the same rigor they applied to their sword drills. The ink pool was an even more precise instrument. By resting the brush on the paper for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, a calligrapher could create a small, dark blot where the ink bled outward. The size, darkness, and shape of this pool became a unit of measurement, A large, deep, and perfectly round pool of ink might symbolize the day of the full moon. A smaller, lighter, and more elliptical pool could represent a crescent moon, indicating an earlier date in the lunar cycle. The placement of this pool within the text was its own cipher. A bakashi located near the top of the scroll could point to an action at dawn, its darkness evoking the lingering night. A similar pool placed near the end of a line, trailing off the edge, might signal an event at dusk as the light fades. Imagine a general receiving a seemingly innocuous poem about the autumn harvest. As his eyes travel down the page, he notes the flow. The characters begin evenly spaced, but then he sees it, a significant pause after the character for wind, creating a wide gap on the paper. Later, on the character for rice, there is a pronounced dark pool of ink. He knows the code. The pause after wind means a wait of 3 days. The pool on rice, which is the 8th character in the poem, indicates the 8th hour. The message is clear. Hold your position for 3 days, then attack at 8 in the morning. The entire coordinated campaign hinges on this silent, elegant command embedded within a piece of art, completely invisible to any enemy scout who might intercept the scroll. This method was so effective because it weaponized the very essence of artistic expression. It exploited the assumption that rhythm in calligraphy is purely about beauty and emotion. An enemy codebreaker looking for numbers or ciphers would find nothing. He would see only the natural, human cadence of a writer, complete with its thoughtful pauses and occasional heavy ink. He would admire the artistry, completely missing the fact that he was looking at a military timetable of breathtaking precision. The samurai didn't just hide their secrets in their art. They made the heartbeat of their art become the secret itself. This deep-seated connection between a clan and its script brings us to one of the most personal and uncrackable security systems ever devised, the calligraphic bloodline. Just as every individual's handwriting is unique, the great samurai clans of feudal Japan cultivated distinct, house-specific calligraphic styles that functioned as heraldry in motion. These were not mere preferences in flair. They were meticulously developed artistic signatures, passed down from generation to generation like a biological trait. To know a clan's style was to recognize its voice on paper, and to replicate it perfectly was a feat considered nearly impossible for an outsider. The development of these styles was a painstaking, lifelong process. From a very young age, a samurai scion would begin his training not just with the sword, but under the strict tutelage of the clan's master calligrapher. This was often a retired elder, a respected relative, or even the daimyo himself. The student wouldn't simply learn standard characters. He would be drilled in the unique nuances that defined his family's hand. This included a specific angle for holding the brush, a particular pressure applied on the downward stroke, a trademark flick of the wrist at the end of a line, and even a characteristic way of dotting a character. These subtle habits, ingrained through thousands of repetitions, became as natural and identifiable as a walk or a laugh. They were the clan's calligraphic DNA. This made document authentication astonishingly simple and secure for those within the system. A lord would receive a scroll from an allied clan. Before even reading the content, his eye would sweep over the characters, subconsciously checking for the familiar rhythm and weight he knew so well. He would look for that telltale heavy start to the horizontal bars that was the hallmark of the Taikta clan, or the elegantly elongated vertical strokes favored by the Oda. A forgery wouldn't just have the wrong information. It would feel wrong. It would lack the inherent, unthinking flow that comes from a lifetime of muscle memory. The spacing would be off, the energy inconsistent. It would be like hearing a perfect recording of a loved one's voice almost right, but missing the soul, the tiny imperfections that make it genuine. The consequences of a failed forgery were severe. An impersonator attempting to issue false orders or forge an alliance could be identified instantly through his clumsy imitation. This system protected more than just military secrets. It safeguarded the entire economic and social structure of the clan. Land deeds, tax records, marriage contracts, and letters of introduction all carried the weight of this calligraphic seal. A document without the correct stylistic fingerprint was considered null and void, a worthless piece of paper. This placed immense cultural value on artistic mastery, making the preservation of the clan's calligraphic identity a duty as serious as defending its borders. The brush, in this context, was the ultimate guardian of legacy, ensuring that the authority of a great house could be expressed and verified for centuries without ever being stolen. And so we arrive at the most profound and personal application of this art, a practice that fused the samurai's entire life into a single defining moment of ink, the last stroke principle. In their final breaths, facing the inevitable with a clarity most of us will never know, these warriors would often call for a brush. This was not a mere final wish. It was the ultimate test of their discipline, a final statement of their spirit intended to echo through the ages. With failing strength, they would pour every ounce of their remaining life force, their kai, into composing one perfect character. This was their jaisai, their death poem, rendered not just in words, but in the very energy of the stroke itself. The setting for these acts was charged with an almost unbearable intensity. A mortally wounded samurai on a battlefield, surrounded by the carnage of his final stand, might use his own blood as ink to trace a character on a piece of torn armor or a stray banner. In a quiet room, a revered elder dying of illness would be propped up by his students, his trembling hands steadied by decades of muscle memory as he prepared his ink with a ceremonial slowness. The atmosphere was one of profound reverence and silent witnessing. Those present understood they were not just watching a man die. They were witnessing the final, crystallized expression of an entire philosophy of life. Every movement, every labored breath leading to the moment the brush touched paper was part of the performance. The content of these final writings varied dramatically, offering a raw window into the individual's soul at the moment of passing. Some chose a single, powerful kanji character that served as a summary of their core belief. The character for dream, Chinese letter yum, might be written with an ethereal, fading touch, suggesting a life viewed as a beautiful, transient illusion. The character for duty, Chinese letter gi, could be rendered with such fierce, unshakable strength that it seemed carved into the paper rather than painted, a final testament to unwavering loyalty. Others penned short poems, often in the classic tanka form, blending the beauty of the natural world with the acceptance of mortality. A common theme compared life to a dewdrop trembling on a leaf, beautiful and gone with the morning sun. The true mastery, however, lay not in the word chosen, but in the technique used to write it. This was where a lifetime of training manifested itself spectacularly. A samurai's final stroke was meticulously analyzed by masters who came after him. They would look for the telltale signs of a spirit at peace or a spirit in turmoil. A character written with a calm, steady hand, with perfect pressure and balance from start to finish, indicated that the writer had achieved mushin no mind and faced the end without fear or hesitation. It was the ultimate victory. Conversely, a character that began strong but ended in a ragged, chaotic smear or one that showed a sudden tremor, told a different story, a moment of fear, of struggle, of the body finally betraying the will. These were not judged as failures, but as heartbreakingly human documents of the struggle against the inevitable. Perhaps the most famous and chilling example of this practice is attributed to the legendary swordsman Tsukahara Bokuden. On his deathbed, he is said to have written the single character Win Chinese letter Katsu with a flourish. But then, with his very last ounce of strength, he deliberately slashed a final, powerful line straight through the center of the character. This was not an accident. It was a final, profound lesson from a master. By striking through Win, he was symbolizing the ultimate emptiness of victory in the face of death. It was a statement that in the end, everyone is equal, and that true mastery lies not in conquering others, but in understanding the futility of the very concept of conquest. This one defiant act of calligraphy became a koan, a puzzle to be pondered for centuries, its meaning as sharp and cutting as the stroke that made it. These deathbed scrolls were treated as sacred relics, preserved with far greater care than any weapon or suit of armor. They were passed down through generations, not as morbid curiosities, but as the spiritual last will and testament of an ancestor. A young samurai would be shown the final stroke of his grandfather, and in its powerful, unwavering lines, he would be expected to find courage and a model for how to face his own end. The paper itself, often stained with blood or showing the faint sweat of the author's brow, was a tangible connection to that moment of truth. It was a physical embodiment of the bushido ideal, to live every moment with the awareness of death, and when death finally came, to meet it not with a cry of anguish, but with the quiet, focused determination of a perfectly executed stroke. In the end, the brush proved mightier than the sword, for while the sword could only end a life, the brush could define its entire meaning in a single, breathtaking gesture. The samurai's quest for the perfect invisible ink drove them to become unlikely alchemists, experimenting with the very chemistry of their world to create messages that could appear and vanish on command. Their most ingenious formulas exploited the natural properties of common substances, turning the everyday into the extraordinary. One of the simplest yet most effective inks was made from nothing more than fresh milk. A message written with a fine brush dipped in milk would be completely undetectable once it dried, leaving the paper looking pristine and untouched. To reveal the secret, the recipient would gently heat the paper over a candle flame, being careful not to let it scorch. The organic compounds in the milk would caramelize from the heat, turning a light brown and making the writing suddenly visible. This method was prized for its simplicity and reliability, a favorite for quick, short-term communications that needed to leave no trace behind. For messages that required a different kind of trigger, they turned to the citruses growing in their gardens. The acidic juice of fruits like the bitter yuzu or the date-eye orange provided another clear, effective ink. When applied to paper, these juices would dry transparent, but they possessed a hidden sensitivity to ultraviolet light. A scroll written with citrus ink and left in the bright moonlight, particularly under a full moon, would slowly reveal its message as the UV radiation catalyzed a reaction in the organic compounds, causing them to darken. Alternatively, holding the paper close to a heat source would achieve the same effect more quickly. This made citrus-based inks wonderfully versatile. They could be developed with either the subtle energy of the moon or the direct warmth of a hand, offering operatives multiple ways to read their secrets without drawing attention. The pinnacle of their chemical craft, however, was reserved for the most critical and long-term secrets, involving complex formulas that used mineral salts and required a two-part chemical process. These were the inks of master spies and high-level strategists. A samurai might create an ink using a solution of lead acetate, which would dry to leave an invisible, sugary-tasting residue on the paper. The message remained hidden until the recipient lightly brushed over the paper with a feather or a cloth soaked in a developer's solution, such as hydrogen sulfide water. Where the developer touched the invisible lead salt, it would trigger a reaction, turning it into a visible, dark brown lead sulfide stain that spelled out the message. This kind of ink was incredibly secure because it required the recipient to possess not only the message, but also the correct chemical key to unlock it. Another sophisticated formula involved using a dilute solution of tannin from gallnuts, a type of growth found on oak trees. This ink was itself invisible, but it had a powerful affinity for iron. When the recipient prepared a developer made from a simple iron sulfate solution and brushed it across the paper, the tannin and the iron would instantly combine to form a dark, permanent ink called iron gall ink, causing the message to spring into being in a deep, enduring black. This reaction was not only dramatic, but also created a permanent record, making it ideal for information that needed to be revealed once and then preserved for a long time, such as the true terms of a treaty or the identities of a deep cover network that would be activated years later. These chemical innovations highlight a dazzling level of scientific curiosity and application that contradicts the simplistic image of the samurai as only warriors. They were keen observers of nature, understanding and manipulating chemical properties centuries before modern chemistry gave them names. Their invisible inks were not just tricks, they were tools of immense strategic depth, ensuring that their most dangerous words could cross enemy lines hidden in plain sight, waiting for the precise moment, a beam of moonlight, a breath of heat, or the stroke of a reactive brush to step out of the shadows and change the course of history. From the realm of sensory manipulation and chemical warfare with ink, we arrive at perhaps the most cerebral and unsettling application of all, the transformation of calligraphy into a direct instrument of psychological combat. Beyond maps and hidden messages, a specialized group of spiritual warriors delved into the very nature of perception itself, crafting meditative patterns designed not to communicate, but to overwhelm. These masters viewed the scroll not as a carrier of information, but as a portal to altered states of consciousness, a tool to hypnotize, disorient, and spiritually disarm an opponent before a single blade was ever drawn. The foundation of this practice lay in a deep understanding of visual psychology and the power of rhythmic repetition. These warrior artists, often steeped in the esoteric practices of certain Buddhist sects like Shingon or the intense meditation of Zen, created works that were essentially optical and cognitive traps. They employed specific, hypnotic visual principles, concentric circles that seemed to pulse and vibrate, maze-like patterns of interlocking kanji that created impossible figure-ground relationships, and spirals that pulled the viewer's gaze relentlessly inward towards a dizzying void. The goal was to overload the viewer's conscious mind, causing a sort of cognitive short circuit that could induce trance, confusion, or even vertigo. In a culture where mental clarity and focus were paramount, this sensory attack was a direct assault on a warrior's greatest asset, his disciplined mind. The most immediate application was as a pre-combat psychological weapon. Imagine a rival samurai commander invited to a negotiation only to be presented with a gift, a stunningly beautiful, large-scale scroll from his host. As a gesture of courtesy, he would be expected to study it closely, His eyes would travel the intricate paths of the design, unconsciously following the artist's intended track. Within minutes, he might begin to feel a strange sense of disorientation, a difficulty in focusing his thoughts, or a subtle but pervasive sense of unease. He wouldn't be able to pinpoint why. The art was masterful, but by the time he left the meeting, his mental edge would be blunted, his confidence subtly eroded. He had been psychologically primed for failure, his subconscious already agitated by a visual melody he couldn't quite hear. On the battlefield the next day, that slight hesitation, that flicker of doubt, could be the difference between life and death. This art found a more direct and terrifying use in interrogation. A captured spy or defector would be subjected to a different kind of pressure. Instead of physical torture, which could yield unreliable information, an interrogator might use these hypnotic scrolls. The prisoner would be forced to gaze at a specific, swirling pattern for hours under the low, flickering light of a single lantern. The relentless visual rhythm, combined with sleep deprivation and the stress of capture, would often break down mental defenses more effectively than any blade. The conscious mind, exhausted from trying to make sense of the impossible patterns, would eventually shut down, allowing the interrogator to access subconscious truths or implant suggestions. The scroll became a key to unlocking the mind's deepest vaults, a silent, relentless questioner that asked its demands not with words, but with spirals and pulses. The creation of these weapons required the artist to enter a profound trance state themselves. The process was considered as dangerous as forging a legendary sword. The calligrapher would undergo lengthy purification rituals, fasting, and meditation to achieve a state of intense, focused intention. It was believed that the spiritual energy, the ki of the artist, was infused directly into the ink strokes during this process. A scroll created with malicious intent, filled with chaotic, aggressive energy, could theoretically transfer that agitation to the viewer. Conversely, a pattern designed to soothe and mesmerize could lower defenses completely. This belief blurred the line between art and magic, where the brushstroke was not just a mark of ink, but a conduit for the artist's own spiritual force, making each piece a frozen snapshot of a powerful psychological state, waiting to be unleashed upon an unsuspecting viewer. This was the ultimate fusion of the samurai's spiritual beliefs and their pragmatic art of war, turning empty space and black ink into a battlefield for the human soul. Yet the most devastatingly beautiful layer of their secretive art was not written in ghost ink or layered paper, but in the most revered form of all, poetry. To the outside world, the samurai were not just warriors. They were cultured elites, expected to compose and appreciate verse. This public facade became the perfect cover for their most brilliant deception. They mastered the art of crafting poems that shimmered with two entirely different meanings: innocent, elegant nature verses for any casual reader, and precise, deadly military intelligence for the initiated few who held the key to their metaphorical language. The foundation of this system was the deep, shared cultural knowledge of classical Japanese poetry, or waka. Every educated samurai was steeped in the same anthologies, the same seasonal imagery, and the same poetic conventions. A poem about autumn leaves was never just about autumn leaves. It could evoke themes of decline, impermanence, or a looming end. A verse about a lingering morning mist might symbolize confusion or concealment. The samurai weaponized this shared symbolic lexicon. A seemingly straightforward poem about a waterfall cascading down a rocky mountainside could, to a specific general, detail the planned route and timing for a downhill cavalry charge. The waterfall was the charge itself. The rocks were the defensive positions to avoid, and this sound described the intended number of troops. The structural rules of Waka, with its strict 5-line, 31-syllable format, provided a rigid framework for encoding data. The position of a word within a line could correspond to a date on the lunar calendar. The number of syllables in a specific line might indicate the number of soldiers to be deployed. A particular seasonal keyword, or keigo, could signal the exact month for an operation to begin. For instance, cherry blossoms invariably pointed to early spring, but in a coded poem, it might mean the 3rd day of the 3rd month. The recipient, privy to the cipher, would read the poem not for its aesthetic beauty, but as a precise set of operational orders, each floral image and natural phenomenon meticulously translating into a time, a place, or an action. Consider the potential meaning hidden within these lines. The evening moon / hides behind a veil of cloud / one lone bird calls / to the still and silent pines / awaiting the coming storm. To a courtier, this is a melancholic and beautiful image of nightfall, but to an allied commander, this could be a clear warning. The evening moon hiding might be code for a spy whose cover is compromised. The lone bird call could represent a single, attempted communication. The silent pines might be his own agents, ordered to maintain absolute radio silence. And the coming storm is a direct alert that a raid is imminent. The poem's entire narrative is a covert distress signal, masquerading as art. This practice required a breathtaking level of intellectual discipline. A samurai spy had to be a master poet in his own right, capable of composing verses that were not only technically flawless and beautiful enough to pass casual inspection, but also geometrically precise in their hidden meaning. A single misplaced syllable or a poorly chosen metaphor could render the message useless or worse, dangerously misleading. The act of creation was a high-wire act of holding two complete and complex ideas in mind simultaneously, the overt and the covert, and weaving them together into a seamless whole. It was the ultimate fusion of the warrior and the artist, where the pressure to create a masterpiece was as intense as the pressure to survive a duel, for the consequences of failure were just as final. This deep connection to the brush extended even further, into the realm of the unseen, where the samurai sought to read the future not in stars or bones, but in the very ink they spilled. For these warriors, whose lives hung on the thinnest thread of chance, calligraphy became a powerful form of battlefield divination, a way to seek guidance from the chaotic forces of fate through the medium they controlled best. They believed that the brush was not just a tool of their will, but a conduit to deeper truths, and that by carefully observing its unintended behaviors, they could glimpse the outcome of a coming battle before a single sword was ever drawn. The practice was known as shodo uranai, or calligraphy divination, and it transformed the act of writing into a sacred ritual of prognostication. On the eve of a great conflict, a general or a respected spiritual advisor within the ranks would retreat to a quiet space to prepare. The process was meticulous, beginning with intense meditation to clear the mind of desire and open it to interpretation. The paper was carefully selected, the inkstone purified with a few drops of clean water. As the ink stick was ground in slow, deliberate circles, the diviner would focus his entire intention on the impending battle, formulating a silent, urgent question for the universe. The moment the brush was dipped was charged with anticipation. It was no longer just a writing instrument, but a dowsing rod for destiny. The actual act of writing was then performed with absolute focus, but the content was almost secondary. The true object of study was not the character itself, but the anomalies that occurred during its creation. An accidental splatter of ink, which most artists would consider a ruinous mistake, was here a vital omen. A single, unexpected droplet, flying from the tip of the brush to land on the corner of the paper, could be interpreted as an enemy ambush from an unexpected direction. If that droplet was large and dark, it might signal significant casualties. If it was small and faint, it could mean a minor skirmish or a warning to be extra vigilant. The specific placement of the splatter on the page, top, bottom, left, or right, corresponded to different phases of the battle or different units within the army, creating a symbolic map of the conflict to come. Even more telling than splatters were the subtle variations in the flow of ink from a single, unbroken stroke. A strong, confident line that suddenly developed a faint, hesitant tremor was read as a sign of a hidden weakness in their lines or a moment of potential faltering in morale. Conversely, a stroke that began weakly but grew stronger and more defined toward its end was an extremely positive sign, indicating that initial setbacks would be overcome, leading to an ultimate victory. The diviner would study the bleed of the ink into the absorbent paper, believing that a clean, sharp edge to a character signaled clear and decisive action, while a fuzzy, blurred edge warned of confusion, miscommunication, or fog of war that could cloud their efforts. The brush itself was also a subject of intense scrutiny, its wear and tear seen as a mirror for the condition of the troops. A bristle that came loose during writing and embedded itself in the paper was not an annoyance, it was a specific omen. If it was a long bristle, it might represent a high-ranking officer. Its position relative to the characters could indicate if that officer would be separated from the main force or even fall in battle. The way the tip of the brush wore down over time was also symbolic. A brush that frayed evenly was a sign of a unified and resilient army. One that developed a lopsided, jagged tip was a warning of internal discord or a faction that was not pulling its weight, a potential point of failure that needed command attention before the fighting began. This unique fusion of artistic practice and military superstition provided a crucial psychological function. In the face of the unbearable uncertainty of war, it offered a sense of agency, a way to feel that the universe was not entirely random, and that clues to survival could be found in the smallest details of their own disciplined craft. Whether the omens were objectively real was beside the point. The act of seeking them focused the mind, reinforced discipline, and could either steel a commander's resolve for a difficult fight or counsel a necessary strategic patience. The brush in the hands of a samurai was never just a brush. It was a sword, a cipher, a map, and finally, a window into the future, proving that for these warriors, every aspect of their existence, down to a single drop of spilled ink, was part of their endless preparation for the ultimate test. Even in the most desperate confinement, stripped of brush, paper, and ink, the samurai's mind remained a weapon. Their deepest training could not be so easily taken away. For those imprisoned in stone castles or held captive in enemy compounds, this ingrained knowledge of calligraphy became the key to a silent language, a sophisticated tap code system that turned the very structure of their prison into a conduit for secrets. This was not a simple alphabet being spelled out. It was a far more elegant and secure method based on the fundamental principle every samurai knew by heart: the sacred, unchangeable order of strokes required to write a kanji character. Imagine two samurai held in separate adjacent cells, their only connection the cold, thick stone wall between them. A guard walking the corridor would hear only faint, random taps. easily dismissed as a prisoner idly knocking, or perhaps the settling of an old building. But to the trained ear on the other side, those taps were a clear, articulate voice. The system was built on the universal understanding of stroke order. Every educated person in feudal Japan, and certainly every samurai, learned to write characters in a specific, non-negotiable sequence. This was not just about aesthetics. It was the foundation of legibility and rhythm. A character written out of order would look wrong, feel wrong, and be immediately identifiable as the work of an amateur. For a captive samurai, this universal rule became his cryptographic engine. The process worked with meticulous precision. The sender would first choose a specific kanji that represented the core of his message. Let's say he wanted to warn his ally about a planned attack at dawn. He might choose the character for East Chinese letter as the sun rises in the east. He would then mentally deconstruct this character into its individual strokes, following the exact order he had practiced 10 times. The character Chinese letter has 8 strokes, each with a specific type and direction. First a horizontal line, then a vertical, then a diagonal, and so on. He would then tap against the wall to signal the start of a character. A single, clear tap might mean, "I am about to send a character." Then he would tap out a sequence that represented the number of strokes in that character. For Chinese letter, he would tap 8 times. His companion, listening intently, would now know to expect an 8-stroke character. Now the true cipher began. The sender would tap out the sequence of strokes, but he wouldn't describe them. He would identify them by their standardized numerical position within the official stroke order catalog every samurai carried in his mind. The first tap after the count would represent the type of the first stroke. Perhaps 1 tap meant a simple horizontal line. 2 taps meant a vertical line. 3 taps a left-falling diagonal. The listener, hearing these signals, would be mentally assembling the character stroke by stroke in real time. After the first series of taps, he would know the first stroke was, for example, a horizontal line. The sender would then pause, signaling the end of that stroke's description, and then move to the next set of taps to describe the second stroke. This would continue until the entire character was transmitted. The recipient, having mentally reconstructed the character, would then understand the word east, and from the context of their situation, infer the meaning. The attack is coming from the east, or it is coming at dawn. The system's true genius was its immense security. Even if an enemy guard suspected something and tried to listen in, the code was indecipherable without the key. And the key was not a written cipher that could be discovered, but the entire cultural and educational framework of the samurai class. A guard might hear a sequence like tap start signal, 8 taps stroke count, 2 taps stroke type vertical, pause, 1 tap stroke type horizontal, pause, 3 taps stroke type diagonal, and so on. Without the mental library of kanji and their precise stroke orders, these numbers were just meaningless noise. There was no way to reverse engineer the message without knowing which 8-stroke character was being constructed from that specific sequence of stroke types. It was a language within a language, a whisper woven from the muscle memory of the brush, proving that even in total darkness, the samurai could still write their secrets on air. This fascinating blend of art and wellness might seem like pure superstition, but it reveals a sophisticated understanding of the mind-body connection that the samurai cultivated through their brushwork. When a warrior was wounded, either in battle or during intense training, the healing process was seen as another form of combat, a fight for internal balance. The samurai believed that sickness and injury were not just physical events, but manifestations of disrupted spiritual energy, or kai. Just as a perfectly executed sword stroke required the harmonious flow of this energy, so too did the body's recovery. The brush, already a tool for focusing kai, became a natural instrument for restoring it. The practice was deeply ritualized. A healer, often a senior samurai versed in both medicine and calligraphy, would prepare with meditation to achieve a state of mushin, that same clear, intention-filled emptiness required for battle or encryption. He would then grind his ink with a specific therapeutic purpose in mind, sometimes even incorporating medicinal herbs or minerals directly into the mixture. The paper itself was often a bandage or a small slip to be attached to a medicine bottle. The act of writing was not a simple label. It was a transfer of energy. With each stroke, the calligrapher focused his intention to heal, to soothe, or to strengthen, channeling that purpose directly into the characters. The resulting talisman was then applied directly to the body or attached to a poultice, believed to act as a continuous conduit for healing energy. Commonly used characters included those for life, Chinese letter enachai, to heal, Chinese letter kai, and harmony, Chinese letter wa. But perhaps the most powerful were the sacred Sanskrit symbols known as Siddha letter 1843, or the Japanese transliterations of Buddhist mantras like Om Mani Padme Hum. These were not chosen for their literal meaning alone, but for their vibrational quality and the specific brush movements required to write them. The belief was that the very shape of the character, when drawn with perfect intention, resonated with the body's own energy pathways, helping to reestablish a healthy flow and accelerate natural recovery. A bandage inscribed with the character for bone, Chinese letter hone, written with strong, unbroken strokes, was thought to literally lend its structural integrity to a fracture. The most compelling aspect of this practice isn't found in feudal scrolls, but in modern scientific journals that are just beginning to explore the placebo effect and psychoneuroimmunology. While we can dismiss the idea of magical ink, we cannot so easily dismiss the remarkable historical accounts of its effectiveness. There are numerous records of wounded samurai recovering from fevers more quickly, or reporting significantly reduced pain after the application of these calligraphic bandages. From a contemporary perspective, we can interpret this through a different lens. A wounded warrior, seeing a respected superior perform this careful, sacred ritual on his behalf, would experience a profound psychological boost. This wasn't just a bandage. It was a tangible symbol of care, a ritual that inspired immense hope and activated the body's own powerful self-healing mechanisms. The patient's belief in the treatment, combined with the meditative state of the calligrapher, likely created a powerful feedback loop that genuinely influenced physiological outcomes. Today, researchers are studying how focused intention and mindful practices can affect health, and the results are startlingly aligned with the samurai's intuitive understanding. Studies on the placebo effect confirm that belief and expectation can measurably alter brain chemistry, reduce inflammation, and modulate the immune response. The samurai's calligraphic first aid was, in a very real sense, an advanced and culturally specific application of this principle. They were leveraging the power of ritual, symbolism, and focused attention, the same mental discipline they used to win battles, to win the war against injury and illness. It shows us that for the samurai, the brush was not just a weapon for dealing death, but an equally powerful instrument for preserving life, proving that true mastery was ultimately about the balance and application of energy in all its forms. But perhaps the most extreme and awe-inspiring application of this chemistry was the creation of what we might call the true vanishing masterpiece, a document engineered not just to become invisible, but to physically self-destruct, obliterating its secrets so completely that no enemy could ever prove they even existed. This was the pinnacle of information security, a brilliant and terrifying answer to the problem of what happens if your perfect, undetectable message actually falls into the wrong hands. Certain clandestine schools developed techniques for treating the paper itself, transforming it from a durable medium into a timed explosive in the most literal sense, but without the fire and noise. The process began with the selection of the paper. Artisans would start with incredibly thin, delicate washi, often made from the inner bark of the gampi tree, prized for its smooth, non-fibrous surface. This sheet would then be subjected to a secretive bathing process, soaked in a solution derived from the roots of specific plants known for their high acidity or from mineral salts that were highly reactive to air or light. The paper was then carefully dried in darkness, leaving it looking and feeling perfectly normal, but chemically primed for its own dissolution. The calligrapher would then write the message using a specialized ink, one that itself acted as a mild catalyst or was slightly alkaline, setting the stage for the reaction to come. The act of writing was a race against time, as the very stroke of the brush began a silent, invisible countdown. The moment the scroll was rolled shut, the environment inside became its own executioner. The trapped air, combined with the moisture from the recently applied ink and the treated paper, would initiate a slow, corrosive process. The acidic compounds in the paper would very gradually begin to break down the cellulose fibers. To the recipient, the message would appear perfectly legible when first unrolled. But as the minutes ticked by, they would witness something astonishing and unnerving. The characters would first begin to fade, not like a ghost message, but with a yellowing, sickly tinge. Then, the paper itself would start to become brittle at the edges. A faint, almost sweet, chemical odor might arise, the smell of the paper literally digesting itself. Within a predetermined window, often an hour or less, the entire scroll would become so fragile that the slightest touch would cause it to crumble into a fine, confetti-like dust, making reconstruction utterly impossible. Other formulas were designed to react not to air, but to light. A message written on such paper had to be read quickly in a dimly lit room. The moment it was exposed to bright sunlight or held too close to a lantern for more than a few moments, a photochemical reaction would be triggered. The ultraviolet radiation would catalyze the embedded compounds, causing them to rapidly oxidize and burn through the paper fibers. The viewer might see the characters darken momentarily before the entire sheet developed a network of brown, burnt-looking lines, and then simply fell apart. This was a message that could truly only be read once, its lifespan measured in a single, frantic viewing. The samurai had turned the fundamental elements of their world, the very air they breathed, and the light they saw by into partners in a silent, graceful act of total obliteration, ensuring their most dangerous secrets would die with the dawn. For a military commander planning a campaign, accurate weather intelligence was as vital as knowing the enemy's numbers. Long before satellite imagery or barometers, the samurai developed a remarkably sophisticated method for predicting the weather, using a tool they always had at hand, their calligraphy set. These warriors became keen, astute observers of their materials, understanding that the behavior of ink on paper was a direct reflection of the invisible atmospheric conditions surrounding them. The rate at which a droplet of ink was absorbed, the pattern it made as it spread, and the time it took to dry were not random occurrences. They were a precise language spoken by the humidity and pressure in the air, a language these masters learned to fluently interpret. The entire process began the moment they started grinding the ink stick on the stone. The amount of water required to achieve the ideal consistency was their first data point. On a day with high humidity, the air already saturated with moisture, the dry ink stick would absorb water more slowly, requiring less overall liquid to create a rich, dark paste. This alone told them the air was heavy with impending rain. Conversely, on a dry, low humidity day, the powdered ink would seem thirstier, needing more water and grinding longer to reach the same smoothness, indicating a period of clear, stable weather was likely to continue. This initial preparation was a daily ritual that doubled as a meteorological briefing, but the true forecasting happened when the brush met the paper. The absorbent rice paper, or washi, acted as a sensitive hygrometer. A samurai would watch with a trained eye as his first stroke landed. If the ink bled outward quickly, feathering at the edges in a soft, blurry line, it signaled that the paper had absorbed ambient moisture from a humid air mass. This was a reliable warning of rain or snow within the next several hours. The rapid absorption meant the paper's fibers were already swollen with water, leaving less room for the ink, causing it to spread uncontrollably. This was a sign to delay a river crossing, postpone a march through muddy fields, or secure a camp against a coming downpour. Conversely, if the ink sat on the surface for a moment, beating up slightly before being drawn in to create a sharp, crisp, and well-defined character, it was a clear indicator of low humidity and high atmospheric pressure. The paper was dry and ready, the air thin and stable. This promised excellent visibility for scouts, ideal conditions for archery, and firm ground for troop movements. The drying time was the final confirmation. On these dry days, the ink would set almost immediately. On humid, pre-storm days, the written page would remain tacky and vulnerable to smudging for a frustratingly long time, a tangible manifestation of the stifling, saturated air. This wisdom was absolutely critical for naval operations. An admiral planning to move a fleet of troop transports and warships would consult his calligraphy set with the gravity of a modern general studying a weather radar. The specific way ink behaved on paper could predict not just rain, but wind. A curious, swirling pattern in the way the ink dried, with slight concentric circles, might suggest falling pressure and the turbulent, shifting winds that precede a storm. This was a vital warning to keep the ships in harbor. Setting sail into a typhoon could mean the loss of an entire army before they ever saw battle. The samurai's brush, therefore, wasn't just a tool for writing orders. It was an essential instrument for ensuring those orders could even be carried out, protecting countless lives by reading the secrets whispered by water and air. And yet, even the most brilliant chemical inks and self-destructing papers were not their only method of concealment. The samurai's ingenuity extended to the very architecture of their documents, creating masterpieces of physical deception known as dual-layer scrolls. These were not merely papers with hidden writing, but intricate constructions designed to present two completely different realities depending on who was holding them and what they knew. Imagine a scroll that appears to be a perfectly ordinary inventory of temple supplies or a copy of a classic poem. To any official censor or enemy agent, it is utterly benign, not worth a second glance. But in the hands of a trusted ally, this mundane document transforms, revealing battle plans, troop movements, or the identities of spies. The secret lay in the ingenious way these scrolls were physically assembled, turning the craft of papermaking into a high-stakes art of illusion. The most common method involved the meticulous lamination of multiple, incredibly thin sheets of paper. A master papermaker would start by crafting an outer layer with a completely innocuous text, something so boring it would discourage any close inspection. This decoy message was written using standard, non-reactive ink. Then, using a paste made from rice starch and water, they would carefully adhere a second, inner sheet to the back of the first. This hidden core layer contained the true, dangerous message, often written in one of the volatile, invisible inks we discussed earlier. The pasting process was an art in itself. The adhesive had to be strong enough to hold the sheets together seamlessly, yet weak enough that a knowledgeable recipient could gently steam or soak the scroll to separate the layers without damaging the fragile paper. Once separated, the secret inner leaf could be heated or treated to reveal its true contents, while the outer decoy could be discarded or, if necessary, re-adhered to maintain the scroll's innocent appearance. Other scrolls relied on precision-cut windows and overlays. A craftsman might take a single sheet and carefully cut out small, intricate shapes, perhaps the outline of a character or a geometric pattern from its center. He would then paste a second sheet behind this first perforated layer. The true message would be written on this backing sheet, but its words would only be visible through the precisely cut windows when held up to a bright light source. To the naked eye under normal conditions, the scroll showed only the uninterrupted text of the decoy message written around the cuts. But lift it to a lantern or a window, and the light would shine through the openings, illuminating the hidden words beneath like a stencil, creating a completely new and secret text superimposed over the original. This technique required an unbelievable level of precision, as the placement of every cut had to align perfectly with the writing on the secondary layer, a testament to the incredible patience and skill of these artisan spies. Perhaps the most visually stunning method was the use of angled viewing and specialized inks that played tricks with light and perspective. Some scrolls were prepared with messages written using inks that had different reflective properties. A message could be written with an ink that contained finely ground metallic particles, like mica or bronze dust, mixed into the base. When the scroll was laid flat and viewed from directly above, this metallic writing would be camouflaged by the surrounding matte black characters of the decoy text. However, when tilted to a specific angle under a beam of light, the metallic flecks would catch the illumination and glitter, causing the secret message to leap out from the page. The recipient would have to know the exact angle to hold the scroll, a pre-arranged part of the cipher, to make the hidden command visible. It was a method that ensured even if the scroll was captured, the secret would remain invisible to anyone who didn't know the precise trick to viewing it. The legacy of these dual-layer mysteries continues to captivate historians and cryptographers today. In museums and private collections across Japan, there are scrolls that have been identified as potential Niju Makamono double scrolls, but their secrets remain locked away. Conservators face a daunting dilemma. The techniques required to separate these delicate, centuries-old layers without causing irreversible damage are incredibly complex. The chemicals in the inks and the adhesives have aged and changed, making them unpredictable. Applying moisture or heat to a scroll that has survived for hundreds of years could cause the very reaction the samurai intended not to reveal a message, but to destroy it forever in a final act of security. Modern technology like multi-spectral imaging and high-resolution X-ray scanning offers hope, allowing researchers to peer between the layers without physical intrusion. But even these advanced tools can be thwarted by the density of the paper or the composition of the inks. This ongoing puzzle means that right now, in a climate-controlled vault somewhere, There may sit a seemingly mundane record of 16th century rice yields that actually holds the lost battle plans of a famous daimyo, or a poetic verse that contains the true location of a legendary hidden gold hoard. The samurai who created these marvels have been gone for centuries, but their secrets endure, protected by their own cunning craftsmanship. Each of these scrolls is a time capsule and a lockbox, a silent challenge from the past waiting for the right key to be found. They stand as the ultimate testament to a mindset that saw deception not as a mere tactic, but as a deep and sophisticated art form, where the most powerful truths were those that knew how to hide in plain sight. So what we have uncovered is far more than a historical curiosity. It is the story of an entire civilization's mindset, painted in ink. The samurai did not merely practice calligraphy as a hobby. They lived it as a parallel discipline to the way of the sword, a complete philosophical system where every loaded brushstroke was a mirror reflecting the warrior's soul. This was the ultimate fusion of the aesthetic and the pragmatic, where beauty was not an escape from violence but a deeper expression of its nature. In a single, flowing character, a master could simultaneously achieve a state of Zen-like meditation, encrypt a troop movement, map a battlefield, and forge a spiritual talisman. The brush was not a departure from their duty. It was the instrument that perfected it, honing the mind with a sharpness no whetstone could ever provide for a blade. This legacy challenges us to completely reimagine the quiet elegance of historical Japanese art. The next time you stand before a centuries-old scroll in a museum, admiring the bold, confident sweep of a kanji character or the delicate balance of a poem on paper, I invite you to look closer. Look past its undeniable beauty and ask the deeper questions. Is this truly a peaceful meditation, or could it be something more? Could the serene poem about the moonlit pond actually be a general's orders for a midnight attack? Might the faint, ghostly brown stain on the paper be the remnants of a blood oath, a sacred vow that once bound a man's life to his lord? Could the seemingly accidental splatter of ink in the corner be a deliberate omen, interpreted on the eve of a great battle? The blank spaces between the characters, the very texture of the paper itself, might still be whispering secrets to those who know how to listen. The greatest secret the samurai ever kept is not hidden in a specific code or a particular technique. It is woven into the very fabric of their culture, the profound understanding that the most powerful forces in the world are not always the loudest or the most obvious. True strength lies in subtlety, in nuance, in the ability to hold multiple truths within a single, graceful form. Their art teaches us that a thing of profound beauty can also be a formidable weapon, and that the most lasting victories are often won not on the battlefield, but in the silent, focused mind of the artist who knows how to see the world in both black and white, and all the exquisite shades of meaning in between. Their story is written not in history books alone, but in every stroke of ink that has survived them, waiting for us to learn how to read it.